As you know, this is a joint occasion sponsored by the RSE and the Royal Institute of Philosophy. The RSE, as I think most of you will know, is Scotland's National Academy. We have about 1,600 fellows who, as I like to put it, cover the waterfront, every discipline, and commerce, industry, the creative arts. And it's an enormous pleasure to us to be able to sponsor this kind of event. I'm not going to say any more than that because I've done my duty, and I'm going to hand over to Professor John Haldane to introduce our speaker for this evening. John.
So if I may, I'll just begin by saying a few brief words about the Royal Institute of Philosophy. It doesn't enjoy the antiquity of this learned society. It was founded about 90 years ago. Bertrand Russell was involved in that. Lord Balfour, who I think was a fellow of this society and a Prime Minister, was also involved in it. And our own Stuart Sutherland, Lord Sutherland of Houndwood, former President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, is President of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. The day-to-day life, week-to-week, month-to-month life of the Royal Institute is under the very capable directorship of Professor Anthony O'Hare, who's with us here this evening. He's been director for the last 20 years. And I would encourage you, please, to have a look at the Royal Institute of Philosophy's website, if you just Google Royal Institute of Philosophy, and you'll see the various things that it does. Some of those are of the usual sort. There are publications as a journal of philosophy, another journal, Think. But increasingly, it's reaching out beyond its sort of historic commitments through publication and an annual lecture series. We now have debates. I think we had just recently the second annual debate. We've now, as it were, reached up to Scotland, or perhaps since I'm a Scot in Scotland, I should say I reached down to bring the Royal Institute upwards here. You will see, we're very keen really to extend our activities. We do quite a bit of supporting philosophy in schools and so on. So if any of you are looking at that and you have ideas and interests you'd like to express, I'm sure that the director would be very happy to hear from you, particularly, I think, in connection with the idea of philosophy in schools, if there was anybody interested in that. So this is the second annual lecture that we've jointly sponsored. Last year, some of you may indeed have been here last year, we had Michael Ignatieff, the former leader of the opposition party in Canada, distinguished intellectual historian, political theorist, biographer of Sir Isaiah Berlin. And this year, we're absolutely delighted to have as our lecturer Professor Nancy Cartwright. Professor Cartwright was formerly of the London School of Economics, but as you will see here, also of the Department of Philosophy at University of California, San Diego, and now, more recently in Britain, also of the University of Durham. She has contributed very significantly to the philosophy of science, particularly in the sphere of understanding the nature of explanation, and more precisely, explanation as that invokes causes. Any of you who studied, and of course this will be true of some of you who were, say, at a Scottish university, will probably have had to study a certain amount of philosophy, even if you didn't take a philosophy degree. You'll remember that philosophy of science was once really almost reduced to the idea that it consisted in understanding scientific explanation as explanation by subsuming events under laws, general laws. And one thing that Nancy Cartwright has done through her career has really been to fairly consistently subvert some of the simplistic notions of explanation in the physical sciences and the natural sciences, but then increasingly also in the social sciences. And her work has shifted attention really from these rather idealized notions of generalization and scientific explanation to focusing on the capacities of the elements that are, elements in the broader sense, the elements that are involved in systems where those are operating and the way in which those facilitate activity or inhibit activity and so on. So the whole exploration of the idea of powers and capacities of objects was, I think, she made very important contributions to our understanding of scientific explanation. But the the movement of her thought and of her work was really then into the social sciences, including economics, and interested in the nature of explanation in those spheres, and then really from thinking about the nature of explanation and the nature of causes to the way in which knowledge of causes can be used in fashioning practice, in particular public policy. And her work of recent years, both singly and with others, has really been in explorations of the notions of evidence and the role of evidence in policy making, and some of the hidden assumptions, some of the confusions, perhaps some of the fallacies involved in the kind of reasoning that has now become very common when we hear public policy discussed, the way in which there will be appeals to evidence, to what we know, to the kind of tests that are done in one thing and another. And she's done some very important and very interesting and very valuable work in enabling us to understand better some of the hidden assumptions, but also to understand the great potential for this aspect of the philosophy of science for the actual fashioning of public policy. So we're delighted to have you with us this evening. I hope I haven't, well, we've moved on. We're delighted to have you this evening, and I just now invite Professor Cartwright to come up and give us her lecture, Generalising in Science, What's So Good About Missing Out the Differences. So welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here this evening. Here are the authors of the talk I'm going to give this evening, and I'll begin. I don't know if you've seen them, but there have been widespread reports in both professional and more popular venues that a new method can dramatically reduce the spread of AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa, and there it is, male circumcision. Okay. See, for instance, the New York Times. Let's see. I forgot how this one works. Okay, so we start with the New York Times, and one of the most promising proven methods for preventing HIV in Africa is being implemented much more slowly than it should be. Okay, so that's the New York Times. Here's our own BBC. Okay, call for a higher circumcision rate, and slightly more technical, the Scientific American. Also, then, let's look at aid agencies and their endorsement of both the efficacy of this policy and the need to roll it out more quickly and more widely. Here's another one, the World Health Organization. Okay, and some scientific reports, the Cochrane Collaboration. I don't know if you all know about the Cochrane Collaboration, but it's a large, hugely respected independent group that evaluates studies of medical interventions. And there's the Cochrane Collaboration, saying there is strong evidence that medical male circumcision reduces the acquisition of HIV by heterosexual men by between 38 and 66%. And here is a review, the Cochrane review of the evidence their summary of the evidence for their claims. Notice that the evidence consists in 3 large African randomized controlled trials, that they take this to be compelling evidence, and that the kind of language they use is a general language. Remember, my talk is about generalizations. It reduces. It doesn't say anything very, who it reduces for, etc. It reduces. Okay, so now, what's in common here in all of these reports that I've shown you is the use of the term and the language of, first, studies show, right, those 3 African RCTs show, so studies show, and secondly, that what the studies show is it works, right? A general claim with an it in it. Okay. And this is a significant kind of language throughout the Anglophone world now. There's this hugely influential evidence-based policy movement, and we have, for instance, invested heavily in the UK in 7 what works institutions to study what works in crime and early intervention education, health, etc. And what these centers do essentially is to do what the Cochrane Collaboration does, which is evaluate studies to see what the studies show works. Okay, and we've spent a lot of time and money and effort on it. Now, okay. I'm going to argue this evening for 4 theses. Okay, first, studies show very little. I mean, studies can't show anything more than something about the study population. So the studies themselves don't show very much. Okay. Second is, it works is a really bad expression. Okay. Thirdly, you don't get general principles by generalizing. And fourthly, we should take context matters extremely seriously. Okay. Now, my focus, or the focus of Håkan, this is Håkan Second-Elgin and I, who've been doing this work together. Our focus on the idea of context emerged gradually as Håkan attended more and more. Håkan is an expert on HIV, international HIV/AIDS policies, and he's particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And our focus on the idea of context emerged gradually as Håkan attended more and more conferences, including the biannual international AIDS conferences, where new medical discoveries and research outputs on AIDS are presented. Now, these included confirmation of new ways to deliver medicine, the effects of new medical compounds, and different ways to influence behavior change. And what struck him is the last few moments of many of these scientific presentations. The presentations report the efficacy of new compounds on the state of AIDS among patients. They report the ways in which new methods of medicine affect behavior, or generalizations of medical procedures to larger populations. For example, the case I began with, the effects of voluntary medical circumcision on the spread of the disease. So, here's what's to come. I think what's to come has come in the wrong place. So let's move on. So I'm not quite sure how what's to come has come in here. It should have been a little earlier, but I'm now talking about context matters. We will also go on to talk about what context is, generalizing more formally, it works, not likely, and some final thoughts. Okay, so now what we wanted to focus on the last few moments of these papers at the international AIDS conferences. The last moments underline usually the novelty of an approach. They've got a new approach being reported on, and they underline the novelty of it, the efficaciousness of the intervention, and the importance of this approach for fighting AIDS, and often announced as the latest weapon in our arsenal. But the very last sentence, that's the one that remains to be considered. Often, at the very last, the speaker mentions in one breath, of course, context and adherence matter for getting the right outcomes. Then they stop the presentation to take questions. Okay. Now, the euphoria attached to these presentations often hides this last sentence. People think, great, we now have a stronger approach to influence and change the behavior of those who are at risk. Or, we have a new compound to deal with the disease independent of behavior. The way forward at that moment, and often afterwards, seems how to get this new efficacious method of intervention to be part of the global policy process. Its policy relevance seems already established in the arguments for the novelty and efficaciousness that have been presented. Okay? Now, but what about this short sentence on context? If it is true that context matters, what does it mean for the new approach and its policy relevance? What does it mean for the drive to make this new knowledge the immediate basis of a broader policy tool and to implement it across many countries and communities. In one memorable conference session in 2010, talking to an audience of over 2,000 people, one commenter urged, "The idea of treatment as prevention is groundbreaking." He carried on to say that, "As the research presented at this conference shows, if we can get treatment as prevention, we don't even have to use condoms anymore." Now recall, this was recall that this was a medical research, not a medical researcher, but a policy person representing civil society. He was interpreting the policy implications of one of the central discussions at the conference. He generalized the research output presented without hearing the last sentence that we frequently tack on about adherence and context. He generalized the research output presented without hearing the last sentence or thinking about its implications for what he wanted to say. So given this kind of policy translation, is it enough to mention that context matters as a last sentence disclaimer? Okay. For example, think about the kinds of problems one gets into when you do treat it as a last sentence disclaimer. Consider the resistance to circumcision in Africa. It comes from the perceived loss of manhood or sexual pleasure, fear of failed surgeries, the continued necessity of condom use after circumcision, interference with traditional circumcision ceremonies, and distrust of Western medical interventions, to name just a few of the contextual factors that matter. Okay. For instance, see a discussion of these very resistances by a researcher from the University of London, who tells us, all over the world, male circumcision has its roots deep in the structure of society. Far from being a simple technical act, even when performed in medical settings, it is a practice which carries with it a whole host of social meanings. Some of these meanings linked to what it is to be a man, with circumcision taking place as a rite of passage into adulthood in several African and Oceanic societies. In other settings, it carries religious connotations, etc. Now, what I've pointed out here is you'd have thought that at least for this intervention, we wouldn't have had to remind people that it's very likely that context matters. Okay. So context matters because it's if context matters, then it matters because it has been instrumental in the production of the very results in the study settings. So the context will have affected what results you get in the first place in the study. Okay. That's why you can't generalize. And conversely, because context matters, you can't just infer the particular from the general, as I will argue towards the end. Okay. Now, if context matters, it's worth going on to ask something about what context is in this context. I often have some examples of my toaster and my toilet. Pressing the lever on my toaster, I get morning toast. It's not so when I press the lever on the toilet. That's one sense where it's very clear to us all how context matters. But now, what about more social scientific cases? So what's context? Well, here's Clifford Geertz describing his approach to anthropology. Okay? Believing with Max Weber that man is an animal suspended in webs of significance, he himself spun, I take culture to be those webs, and the analysis of it to be, therefore, not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning. For instance, there's more to knowing what winking is than just knowing how one winks. Culture consists of socially established structures of meaning in terms of which people do such things as winking. They do them as signals of conspiracies and join them, or perceive insults and answer them. Okay. So that's Clifford Geertz. How about turning from anthropology to sociology? Tony Giddens, or Lord Professor Tony Giddens, who argues that while the actor maintains a degree of will to act in a given context and influences structures in which she is embedded, this embeddedness also frames her possibilities of action and change. The structures provide resources, opportunities, and constraints for action. The possibility of individuals' action is a function of the interpretive possibilities of agency located within a structure and her engagement with that structure. Or consider also Pierre Bourdieu, who pictures social practice as influenced by what he calls habitus, which he defines as embodied history, internalized as second nature. He argues that people's actions are based on the way in which their past is represented and internalized. This internalization also determines how people think about the future and what they do about it. What is important to emphasize is that the idea of habitus suggests that people's reactions, choices, and actions in relation to events in their lives are always part of a larger cultural and social memory that is part of them. So here then are the lessons I think we can draw from this discussion. Context matters. You can't divorce the social intervention from its social setting, either in climbing up from a study result to some, quote, general conclusion, nor given a general conclusion to climb back down to the social setting. You can't divorce the social intervention from its social setting. You should be very suspicious anytime you see the term studies show, right? Because almost always when we hear the expression studies show, what comes after that is something the study couldn't show, or a handful of studies couldn't show. And thirdly, you can't generalize study results. Okay. I don't mean that we can't learn general truths. I want to claim that you don't get them by generalizing study results. That's not how we arrive in the sciences, social sciences or natural sciences at generalization. So I thought, being a philosopher, I would talk a bit about generalizing more formally. So generalization is a kind of inductive inference going beyond what we already know, and what I think is fairly uncontroversial, but we could discuss it after the formal lecture. There are no good formal systems of induction. What are the rules for doing an induction? You've got a handful of studies. You're very careful about what the study itself shows. What are the rules for doing an induction from them? Well, there are no good formal systems of induction. What I think and want to argue for and endorse is something like John Norton's material theory of induction, which, not a surprise, I like John Norton's view because it's a bit like my own argument theory of evidence, but I'm going to talk about John Norton. John Norton is a very distinguished historian and philosopher of science from the University of Pittsburgh, which is probably still the world center for philosophy of science. Okay. And here's the material theory of induction. According to John Norton, inductive inferences are not warranted formally, but materially. They are justified by facts. Okay? There's no procedure and set of rules. There are rules for how you do, for instance, a randomized controlled trial to get a result about the study population in the randomized controlled trial. In fact, there's a 40-page checklist for how you do a randomized controlled trial. What John Norton is arguing is there is no prescription, right, for how to do an induction. Okay. Inductive inferences are not warranted formally, but materially. They are justified by facts, that is, by the factual matter that is itself the content of argumentation. And he gives this illustration of Marie Curie's induction on radium chloride. And what John Norton is interested in is that Marie Curie generalizes some features and not others, and she generalizes from some studies, some situations and not others. And he wants to say, here's how he talks about her induction on radium chloride. The attempt to explicate it with a schema of enumerative induction failed. So this is laid on in some work of his where he's reviewed all the troubles with standard attempts to provide a formal theory of induction, and then in particular applying any of those ideas to what Marie Curie did. The attempt to explicate her induction with a scheme, some schema like enumerative induction, fails. We cannot justify why the schema should be limited precisely to the few properties of radium chloride that Curie so confidently generalized. Okay? The justification for her restriction, that is generalizing on some features and not others, lies in the researches of chemists in the 19th century. The core result is Hoy's principle, which is generally each crystalline substance has a single characteristic crystallographic form. The principle is grounded, argues Norton, this is all direct quote from John Norton, of course. The principle is grounded in extensive researches into the chemical composition of crystalline structures and into how their atoms may be packed into lattices. That means that once one has found the characteristic crystallographic form of some sample of a substance, generally one knows it for all samples. But how do you know that? You can generalize on the characteristic crystallographic form. That comes, knowing that that's what you can generalize on and not something else, comes from Hoy's principle. Right? Curie's inductive inference is warranted by Hoy's principle and not by conformity to any inductive inference schema. So there's a lot of additional knowledge. It's facts, material facts, the facts that are reported in this principle that justify her inductive inference and not others. For instance, what about Bertrand Russell's chicken? Okay, so I think we know about Bertrand Russell's chicken that the farmer comes and he feeds her regularly. The chicken could even do a randomized controlled trial and lay little traps so that some mornings the farmer trips up and he doesn't arrive and she doesn't get any food in the mornings that the farmer's not there. She's got really good she's got a studies, she's got a number of observations, she's got 364 observations when the farmer comes in the morning, he's going to feed her until Christmas when he turns her into Christmas dinner. Now the trouble with the chicken is not her study design. Her observations were very good, and as I said, she could have done a randomized controlled trial. Right? That her problem was she doesn't know the underlying socioeconomic structure. She doesn't know the very kinds of things that Giddens and Geertz and Pierre Bourdieu were talking about. And it's the material facts that are relevant about the underlying social economic structure that justify or don't the inductive inference. And her inductive inference is based on a wrong understanding of the material facts. Okay. So that's my sort of doctrines about the material theory of induction. Okay. Now, let's go on to this expression, it works. Because, in my view, the claim that it works is just not likely. Okay? And it's not likely for a number of reasons. General principles usually use abstract concepts. Ones in economics are things like utility or response to incentives. We often have mother love, etc. But you use general concepts, but studies should use precise, measurable concepts. Now, I'm trying to get social science examples here, but I often also use an example from a kind of physics example. If you have a body in motion that's subject to no forces, and you do your studies on a Euclidean plane, right, it moves like this. If you might then generalize to bodies in motion subject to no forces will move like this. But then what happens when you go to a saddle or a sphere, right? On a sphere, bodies in motion move like this, subject to no forces. And on a saddle, they'll move like this or like that. And the study results, right, were of local studies using local concepts that seem applicable locally, are not the concepts that go into the what we take to be the true general principle that bodies in motion subject to no forces travel on geodesics. They travel on whatever is a straight line in the relevant geometry. Okay. So again, the underlying geometry is like the underlying social structure with its the habitus. So I think that very often what we find in science is to get useful, true general principles, we have to use very abstract concepts. Okay? But studies of the kind that, particularly in these social spheres that we're talking about, use and should use very precise measurable concepts. Because, for instance, in a randomized controlled trial, it's very important that everybody in the treatment group gets exactly the same treatment. That means that you use a very, very precisely laid out protocol for the treatment. It's at a very concrete level where, with measurement procedures described. And those are not likely to be the kind of concepts that figure in true general principles. So that's one reason. Second is that despite the claims, remember there was those three large African studies, the study results almost always differ. So we're going to now generalize from a bunch of studies that actually have yielded different results. And in part, one of the reasons why we do the systematic reviews, remember I showed you a systematic review from the Cochrane Commission, is because the studies are usually give different answers. It's not as if they all are done in the same way and give the same answer. And so what the systematic review does is it kind of figures out what to make of it given these different results. But if you're doing one, it's okay. And my claim is that the general principles that are supported by these studies are of a different sort in a different vocabulary. And that's why trying to generalize by just taking the result that you find in the study for the study population and saying it works, right, is almost certainly a mistake. I mean, you have to have already done a lot of science to figure out what the it really is that's going to figure in a general principle. So just to back up my claim about how the study results are and ought to be in a very concrete vocabulary, look at some studies on the use of insect-treated bed nets or other programs. And I want to look at studies like this and then look at what the people who've been really endorsing this kind of study-based policy conclude from them. Because it's interesting that, in fact, they draw very broad conclusions in a totally different vocabulary. So here are the people in particular I want to talk about, Esther Duflo and Anat Banerjee. They are members of JPAL, the Jamil Poverty Action Lab, peopled by MIT economists, and have been advocating the use of randomized controlled trials, studies, real detailed studies in populations for the reduction of poverty. And this is a quote from their JPAL website. JPAL's mission is to reduce poverty by ensuring that policy is informed by scientific evidence. We do this through three main activities, and one of them I've cited here: conducting rigorous impact evaluations. JPAL researchers conduct randomized evaluations to test and improve the effectiveness of programs and policies aimed at reducing poverty. So these people are the gurus of randomized controlled trials in development economics. Okay. And then so I want to look at, here's a typical study. Just to look at the vocabulary that's used in the study. It's women who were paid, I guess I've left out a word there, who were paid positive subsidized prices were no more likely to use nets than those who received insecticide-treated nets for free. Or cost sharing does considerably dampen demand. That's the generalization, right? The uptake drops by 60 percentage points when the price increases from 0 to 60 cents, et cetera, et cetera. So on the one hand, we have some very, very concrete vocabulary, right? Cost sharing, in terms of what percentage points and actual dollar values, but it's the study was on pregnant women in Kenya, but we get a kind of general language about the study results. In the first one, it's stuck with the concrete ones. Women who were paid positive were no more likely. I mean, that focuses you on that particular study population. The next quote begins to slip on using a more general vocabulary, using a form of words that suggests a more general conclusion. But what I had wanted to point out was that what the study actually looked at was some very, very concrete behavior in response to a very concrete intervention. Now, let's look then at what Duflo and Banerjee, after years of JPAL doing randomized controlled trials and evaluating various programs around the world. Duflo and Banerjee, this is quoting from The Guardian rather than my summary of what Duflo and Banerjee do. Duflo and Banerjee point out, from looking at bednet studies, conditional cash transfers, zillions of different kinds of interventions in lots of places. Duflo and Banerjee point out that there are some very cheap health interventions which often the poor, so they do talk about a whole massive class of people, the poor, which the poor are reluctant to sacrifice the time or the money to get. For example, oral rehydration, salt and sugar for a sick baby. It's not that they don't care, because the research shows that they worry a lot about their family's health, nor is it that they don't spend money on it. They do, and more than one might expect. So the puzzling conclusion is that the poor spend money on expensive cures rather than cheap prevention. In Indian surveys, they prefer to go to private doctors who are over-medicated. Their health care was often unnecessary and even dangerous. For example, the poor are said to have poor health because they are unable to afford preventative measures, such as mosquito nets, to prevent malaria or an electrolyte treatment for diarrhea. However, Banerjee and Duflo prove that the poor actually bypass such low-hanging fruit for more expensive curative treatments. Or, in the case of hunger, it is commonly held that the poor cannot afford to purchase more food and improve their nutrition. Their low levels of nutrition mean they are too weak to perform well at their jobs and are therefore stuck in what Jeffrey Sachs calls a poverty trap. However, the poor actually spend a sizable chunk of their income on alcohol, tobacco, and festivals, funerals. So here's an example that's reported on in the New York Times, and I'm quoting from the New York Times here. Out here on the endless swamps, a harsh truth has been passed down. There is no fear there but the fear of hunger. The bed nets, the malaria, the insecticide-treated nets are widely considered a magic bullet against malaria. But Mr. Nadefi in Zambia and countless others are not using their mosquito nets as global health experts have intended. Nobody in his hut, including his 7 children, sleeps under a bed at night. Instead, Mr. Daffy has taken his family supply of anti-malarial nets and sewn them together into a gigantic sieve that he uses to drag the bottom of the swamp ponds. Okay. Or again, in malaria hypomesoendemic highland regions of Western Kenya, the gap between net ownership and usage is generally high. Okay, so you own it, but you don't use it. Okay. Now, so what do the RCT gurus conclude from these various studies? Well, what they say is this, and this is now I'm quoting from their book, Poor Economics. The poor do not seem to be willing to sacrifice much money or time to get clean water bed nets, or for that matter, deworming pills or fortified flour, despite their potentially large health benefits. It seems that this might have to do with the reasons that year after year we have trouble sticking to our New Year's resolutions. Okay? The conclusion from the studies, the poor, like the rich, suffer from weakness of the will. Okay? And the recommendation they make is nudges. Okay. Now, what I want to point out here is that we start out with very, very concrete study results by these JPAL economists who urge that we should do these very, very rigorous studies, and the rigorous studies look at very specific, very concretely described interventions, and they get mixed results from their interventions. When they want to start to generalize and say something about it, they move up to the level where they point out that the poor seem not to be willing to take these low-hanging fruit, and then they move up yet another level that what's the real generalization that covers these cases is, well, the poor, like us, suffer from weakness of the will. So in order to find a generalization that accounts for the bulk of their evidence, they do exactly what I claim we do throughout the sciences, is you move up the ladder of abstraction from some very, very concrete study results to a result expressed in hugely abstract vocabulary. Now, in my view, they don't move up that ladder very responsibly. That I didn't need Duflo and Banerjee, having been brought up as a Calvinist, I didn't need Duflo and Banerjee to tell me that we suffer from weakness of the will, and it's not clear to me that they've done the kind of hard work it takes to show that it's weakness of the will that's really what's going on in all of these cases. But I use it as an example to show that I think a nice case of the very people who are, the strongest advocates of the detailed, concrete kind of studies that have a huge amount of rigor in them, when they are driven, really desire to make some generalizations, they do exactly what I think we normally do in science. They move up the ladder of abstraction. Okay, and just so to make sure that some philosophy comes into this talk, there is this is a well-known feature in philosophy. The distinguished 20th century American philosopher Donald Davidson. Donald Davidson claimed, and I'm not sure I believe this, but he claimed that anytime there was a singular causal connection, anytime my doing something caused something to happen, it had to come under a general causal principle. Now, I'm not sure whether I think every time something makes something else happen, it comes under a general causal principle or not. But what was interesting was his take on how the general causal principles related to our descriptions of what actually happened in the concrete case. So Davidson's example is the event which is reported on the first page of the New York Times caused the event which was reported on the 5th page of the New York Times. And his idea was that you could have very good, you could make that claim very well, and it was a true claim, and that was like a concrete study result, right? But that didn't mean, even though it was a true claim, it didn't mean that the descriptions which you were giving of the event were the ones that were causally operative. That he doesn't, I don't think being on the first page, reported on the first page of the New York Times, is what was significant about that event that made it cause the event reported on the 5th page of the New York Times. It's rather some further, more abstract description in terms of which the general causal principle is voiced. So that brings me pretty near to the end. I have some final thoughts. Okay? The thought is that the way up and the way down are the same. So I've been talking about context matters when you want to generalize from a study result. Okay? But really, context matters for both. It matters for getting up to the generalization, and it matters for figuring out what follows down again from the generalization. Okay, we recall Duflo and Banerjee from the claim that Mr. Nadefi uses his mosquito nets to catch fish. They climb up to the general principle, the poor suffer from weakness of will. Okay. Now, imagine we have accepted the general principle, the poor suffer from weakness of will. How do we climb down again to predict what will happen when mosquito nets are offered in South Central Somalia, which is a new program that there's a lot of effort being put into, or male circumcision is rolled out across all of Africa? Okay. You have to understand the context that you're stepping down to in order to have any idea what the general principle amounts to, what it dictates for that context. So we'll have to know a lot about the local context to predict the answers to these questions. Even if we have a true general principle, you have to know, if you want to use my example of the objects subject to no forces travel on geodesics, you have to know a lot about the local geometry to know, what's a straight line there. Okay? But I think, it's more important that we focus on these social cases. So I think I've come to my conclusions, which are very few, 3. What general principles can a local result support? So what general principles can you get to from a local result? You can't tell just by looking at the result, right? The material theory of induction tells you you have to know a whole lot of other material facts in order to figure out what follows from what the study result is relevant to. What local predictions can a general principle support? Again, you can't tell just by looking at the principle itself. In both cases, context matters. So, thank you.
Professor Cartwright has kindly agreed a little discussion period.
Let's see if I can sit. Oh,
Questions
good, thank you.
and observations can be made by members of the audience. We have microphones available. And if you'd like to raise a question or make an observation, then that will be brought to you. Just while people are sort of gathering their thoughts, maybe I could just get things underway by asking you something rather general. Sorry, are people hearing us at the back all right? Yeah, I'm sorry. Are you hearing us at the back? Yes, you are. Sorry, yeah. It might help people to get a sort of grip on one aspect of what you said earlier on, if you were to say just a little bit more, and if I indicate what that is. You spoke about enumerative induction, or what's sometimes known as mathematical induction, and that's the kind of induction with which people will be familiar, that a certain number of observed cases have been such and such, and then from that people try to draw some general conclusion about things of this sort.
Like the chicken.
Like the chicken or whatever else it may be. And you wanted to say, well, this doesn't actually correctly represent what had gone on, or what often goes on, and you give us an example.
What should go on?
Well, what should go on, all right. I just want to get a little bit clearer about that. So, I mean, another kind of induction with which people used to be perhaps familiar was what came to be known as abduction, or abstractive induction. So this is not by, as it were, observing instances and then saying such and such a percentage of them and so on, but has been in one way or another seeing something in an instance, as it were, looking into an instance, examining it in some way, and seeing what might be a salient or relevant feature of it. And then in seeing that in the instance, seeing thereby that anything that is likewise an instance of the same kind is going to be possessed of the same mechanism or feature or characteristic or whatever else it may be. And that's sometimes been put in certain methodologies by talking about a kind of insight, as it were. But what language we use here isn't really so much what's at issue. I just wanted to ask you how that sort of induction, moving from the particular to the general through the observation or postulation of some feature as being salient, relevant here, and so on, is related to what you think was going on in the Marie Curie, or what...
I think that is what's going on.
That's what I wanted to ask you about, yeah.
That's what John Norton is cashing out.
Yeah.
What justifies or warrants the Marie Curie generalization is some material facts about crystal structure and some significant feature, but what he would deny, and I would deny, is that you get that by insight. Right. You get it by hard scientific work to come to understand what the significant features might be, to learn to understand what kinds of features of crystals generalize and what kinds don't, just like you can sometimes generalize. The example you've heard me give is swan 1 is white, swan 2 is white, swan 3 is white, so all swans are white. Well, it turns out that we don't have the right kind of material facts that suggest that swan color is something which is fixed to the species, but there are other features that we have learned through hard work are, if one member of the species has it, probably they all do. And that's, I mean, all of those are defeasible claims. You know, we're never certain, and we might have them wrong, but without those, we're not warranted in generalizing, and moreover, whether we admit to it or not, we are actually usually fairly alert to them, and we don't generalize.
But can I just press you on that? Because somebody who was a defender of enumerative induction, saying that this really is what we have available to us, and perhaps it's all that we have available to us, will say, okay, well, you didn't want to take up the notion of insight in some way. There's a lot of hard work goes on in the identification of these material factors and so on. But they might then think, well, isn't the hard work just enumerative induction? I mean, isn't it that what we do is we look at cases, we identify that certain percentages of these cases seem to just support this and so on. So could you just say a little bit about what's involved in this hard work that isn't enumerative induction, just gathering cases?
Well, one thing is concept development. So, I mean, I've wanted to argue, I claim that a lot of our more general truths are in a vocabulary that doesn't come natural to us. And it takes work to evolve that vocabulary. And it's not a matter of induction by which one does it, but it is scientific hard work that does involve a lot of observation and experiment. But you've got these, as Duflo and Banerjee, they had these myriad. They have all these studies, and it's odd, right? They begin to notice something odd about it, that despite trying to make the bed nets free, people still don't take advantage, et cetera, and they then have a hypothesis about or they invoke a general concept that's already available, but it's not a matter of doing by induction. It is a matter of a very complex piece of scientific work to come up with concepts, to test the concepts, to refine the concepts, to find some new cases that you didn't think were relevant, and see that those are really, for instance, you might not prior to Newton, or you might not if you take the kind of caricature story about Aristotelian physics that heavenly bodies behave differently than earthly bodies. You wouldn't take information about how the planets move to be relevant to calculating the trajectory of a cannonball. Right? But once you've got the idea that they're masses and they're just masses or masses wheresoever they are, so you've got a different concept of mass, then suddenly things that were not evidentially relevant before become evidentially relevant. So it's a very complex process.
Just finally on that then, so in this formation of these new concepts, is it that what you think what's going on here is that one's looking for some more adequate general description come explanatory concept? Is that the sort of, so for example, introducing the concept of mass as something that, as it were, transcends the difference of the location of the sublunary or
yeah, it's just that despite your billing of me, I wouldn't talk about them being, I don't think that what's so important is that they're explanatory. I think what's important is that that's where the causal action lies.
Okay, sorry.
Yes,
that's
okay.
right, I understand. Okay, so please feel free to ask questions either of further exposition or about what's been said, or perhaps raising questions about the implications of this for policy and practice. And I see that there's a lady at the back in the penultimate row there.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture with lots of interesting examples. I agree 120% with your importance of context in all kinds of scientific investigation. And I think that one could argue that there's a continuum of the importance of context in going from the physical sciences to the medical sciences to the social sciences. In physical sciences, when we wrote things down in our lab books, it was very important for us to write down exactly what we did and what the context of the experiment was. And that's much less possible in medical research, and even less so in social research. And that's why I think in both of these cases, the context, as you've pointed out, is extremely important. But I think in doing this, in your description, you've made a bit of a caricature of the people you call the RCT gurus. Now, it's for many, many years, and I don't know if you're aware of the work of Schwartz, Flamand, and Louche in clinical trials, where they discuss the difference between what you called efficacy and effectiveness of a treatment, where efficacy is something to do with how it works. So, for example, you might take a pill that reduces your blood pressure, and that might be a good thing, and it might therefore lead on to other benefits. But if the stuff tastes horrible and nobody will take it and it makes you sick, then it's not going to be effective. Now, that's very well understood in the clinical trial literature, and pragmatic clinical trials are designed with an attempt to build the context in place. And for pragmatic clinical trials, it's certainly not true, as you said, that exactly the same treatment must be given to everybody. They don't look at the treatment, they look at the context and what the treatment means in the context. So I think you're a little unkind there. I agree it's very difficult to know how the formal philosophical, how you can link explanatory and pragmatic ideas, but I think the understanding must come from trying to understand how the world works, what the causal mechanism is, as I think you hinted at the end, and trying to understand perhaps what causes the fisherman to need to use his bed nets for fishing is more important than just the clinical trial itself, and to try to understand that as well. But I think, in fact, in the bed net trials, they were carried out as far as, I don't know them in great detail, but I have read some, that they were pragmatic trials that did try to take this into account. And perhaps your fisherman was not typical of the population that they were attempted to help.
Okay, I do, of course, know the language of efficacy and effectiveness, and I don't use it, and I don't use it because I think that it allows us to think we've dealt with context when we haven't. I mean, of course, the nicest thing would be if you could do a pragmatic trial on the very population at the time that you're actually going to have the intervention, and that's just not what we do. So, I mean, it is the case that we have a kind of, I don't want to say lip service, because it's very serious to the attempts to distinguish efficacy from effectiveness, which is a step towards getting us to think about how to do things in context. But the kind of trials are still, there's still studies on particular populations where we look to see what happens. It has happened on that study population, and we still tend to use the same vocabulary and not understand what what was going on in the cultural context of that. Sometimes we do, but it doesn't come out of what comes out of a pragmatic trial is whether or not it works in this context, not why it's working and on what basis one might move it to somewhere else. I also think that you can't have. I actually don't think you can have your cake and eat it too by having the rigor of a randomized trial and allow yourself to adjust the treatment across different individuals. You lose the rigor of the randomized trial, and that's okay. I don't mind losing a bit of rigor there, but if you're losing that kind of rigor and you're relying on a lot of judgments that are backed up by assumptions and some well-grounded assumptions and some unarticulated assumptions, but these variations depend on claims and beliefs one has about the specific cases. Once you start allowing that kind of information in, I can give you lots of other methods for establishing causal conclusions about that same population that might have been a little cheaper or might actually give you better results. I don't mean that these won't give you results. I just think that what I've been opposed to is the idea that this is the only or the best way to find out what the causal connections are in these contexts.
I just got a sense you might want to come back. Did you want to say something further? Or you?
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, I don't know.
I'm sorry, do you have the microphone? Did you want to? You just looked as if you might want to say
Well, I might, but I need to think a bit more about what you
that's
said.
Fine. Of course.
Maybe just very briefly, I didn't actually agree that you have to have exactly the same treatment to be a rigorous. It's not making this treatment standardized that makes a clinical trial rigorous. It's the procedures. But anyhow, an interesting answer. I'm sorry, I need to digest it a bit.
We'll move across here now. I think this. I'm sorry.
We probably disagree about that. It's one of the things that's essential that everyone in the treatment group gets the same treatment. If one wants to actually have a rigorous derivation of the claim, that you have an unbiased estimate of something like a treatment effect.
I disagree, but I'll leave it for
You've lost the microphone at this point. But anyway, sorry. We'd like to in the middle here.
Hi there, thanks very much. That's been very interesting. I'm a medical researcher at the University of Edinburgh here, and when we do our trials, we put all the information together into big papers or several thousand words. But then the problem is we then try and summarize it in a one-page press release for the general audience. And as you highlighted in your first few slides, a lot of the information that's taken from in the journals and then on to into policy statements is from that brief press release, from that concluding paragraph and introduction paragraph. And even though we spend a lot of time writing, as you said, thorough randomized controlled trial protocols, and then go on to include multiple paragraphs on the limitations in the study paper, it's always just the shortened versions that people take on. So what advice do you have for scientific researchers and people going on to try and influence policy about how we can take our research that we have to generalize in some way into a way that's actually more rigorous and useful, rather than just, as you say, generalized with the context?
I don't know that you have to generalize it. I think that what follows generally, or what should happen in a new context, is probably something that requires an expertise different from what you had in designing that trial very well and being very careful about how you reported it. Then that information, it seems to me, if I want to figure out what's going to happen, you might have done a very, very careful trial on deworming, right, and the narrow effects of deworming. You might have done a very careful trial on that, but to figure out what's going to happen when we start not deworming in Kenya, but in say the DEFTA trials in India, then it takes probably a larger team of people who understand something about what the context was in which the trial was done in Kenya, what the context is in these villages in India where the same kind of program is being rolled out. And that, so I think what's important is that things like the World Health Organization recognize, as we know, that life is very complicated, and we don't have these kind of it's just harder than they thought, and we need the cooperation of teams of different kinds of scientists and people with local knowledge to figure out whether it's worth trying in this new place.
Could we take this gentleman here who has his hand up on that side?
Thank you. I wouldn't want to in any way undervalue and underestimate the importance of context, but it seems to me a challenge for you is at the core of your criticism is generalization. And my suggestion is that perhaps you are overgeneralizing the underlying realities of research. As the previous question, the scientists who are doing the research typically have the parameters quite clear. And throughout history, you can see science has learned from one contextual piece of learning allows you to go down the step toward further understanding and the next step of scientific research. So I suggest you're slightly overgeneralizing the criticism.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite follow what. I mean, I agree with everything you said, so I didn't quite, and I thought that everything you said was something that I had endorsed in the talk, so I didn't see quite where I was, I mean, I probably am overgeneralizing to make a point, but I mean, my observations and working for as you have a long time in your field, is that coming up with scientific generalizations that are of interest and are roughly accurate and have the power to help us requires lots and lots of scientific effort, which isn't that trying to move just from a study result to a general principle. That's the claim. And that moreover, when you have the general principle, you have to piece together lots of general principles to get down to predicting what's actually going to happen in a new case. And that seems to me, that I think I'd sort of stand by as a loose generalization that is very widely true of the scientific enterprise across engineering, medical, physics, biology, economics, sociology.
Thank you. We're going to sort of make our way down. Was there somebody else? I thought I saw somebody over there. Was not, perhaps not. Then this gentleman here, and then I think we have some questions.
What might not be so general, I mean, what I was speculating about is, because it's puzzling to me, that general principles seem often to be, our general principles that we find very useful are often in very, very abstract, highly non-operationalizable concepts. I mean, it's not that you can't measure abstract concepts in physics, but you measure them differently in different settings. So it's not that the concept itself is one of these highly concrete kind of measurement-defined concepts. So I am generalizing from almost enumerative induction in saying that it sure looks to me as if the abstract principles that I've found in physics or economics or in sociology that seem to be doing work for us are use highly abstract concepts that really look very different when they're instantiated in different contexts.
Could I ask, there's a gentleman who wants to ask a question here, but just to clarify this for people who won't necessarily already be familiar with this. So you've talked about this, both generalization and abstraction, and you talked about, for example, some very high-level, highly abstract concepts not being operationalizable and so on. Do you just want to give an example of what that might mean so that people really have a sense of what's being said here? You did actually have an example, I think, in the course of the lecture itself, but of concepts that are so abstract that it...
Well, I mean, the example I gave is geodesic, right, which looks very different in different geometrical contexts. So, they are all these motions on a sphere. The shortest distance between 2 points is a great circle, and on a plane like this, it's like that, and on a saddle. So, there's a case where the abstract concept, geodesic, which seems to be the one that matters if we want to find something which is generally true, it looks very different in different contexts. And until you get the abstract concept, you're using these more concrete concepts, the concrete concepts don't generalize. So in economics, they use the concept of utility all the time. And the concept of utility is so abstract as to have, I think, very little utility. I mean, it turns out that the trick is to figure out what constitutes utility in case by case. Or, I always use more mundane examples, like I tell my children to be careful not to hurt their friends' feelings. But the trick is for them to learn context by context what would constitute hurting someone's feelings in this context. So anyway, that's the kind of example I had in mind.
Well, is this working? Yes. I hesitate to take part in this discussion. As a simple scientist, it may be that I'm just going to reduce reductio ad absurdum, but it seems to me you're confusing a principle and its application. You have the principle of gravity. If I let something go, it will fall. Now, if you want to hit something on the ground, you've jolly well got to make sure that there's nothing in between.
Yes.
So, I don't, as a scientist, I don't see the problem. Principles are principles. Applications indeed require careful consideration.
That's true, but that's not. It's not the principle. It's not the way this has been working in these. When the World Health Organization says we're not going to try, we're not going to fund any interventions that haven't passed randomized controlled trials, they are not moving up the ladder of abstraction to come up with a principle that then might have very, very different instantiations in specific cases. They're moving from the very concrete, specific trial results to an exactly identical intervention somewhere else.
But a different context, as you say. The application requires more.
Could you just hold the mic for us? People at the back.
Well,
will
I
hear
agree.
what-
I mean, that's the point. The application, but not only does the application require more, they don't have a general principle to begin with. So that you're talking about the way down, and I spent most of the time talking about the way up to get the general principle. But it's true that the general principle, it will look different in it. I mean, that's a way of expressing it. It will look different in its different applications. That's very seldom what's going on in...
But the principle that a mosquito net, especially a treated one, will reduce the likelihood of infection is a definite principle. The fact that there are problems in applying that principle is another matter.
Well, there are problems in applying the principle that giving mosquito, I mean, that it is not a general principle that giving people mosquito nets for free will reduce their malarial infections.
No, but the net, treated net will reduce it. That is the principle, which the studies have found.
No, the principle is that treated nets will kill mosquitoes, and that has to be pieced together with, I'm sure we agree, that has to be pieced together with a lot of other principles about how people behave in order to make a prediction. Nothing follows from that principle, but that principle has been actually correctly stated. Well, I mean, I still said it very loosely, but that the treatment will repel mosquitoes. I think that's probably a fairly true general principle, but what follows from that about what happens in a specific application, it isn't just the application of this mosquito coming up to this net. It's rather when you take that net and put it into a larger context, then you have to you have to bring into play other local knowledge about what's going to happen.
Down at the front, Professor O'Hare.
Thank you. I'm very sympathetic to your general trend, because one of the banes of my life is a book called Visible Learning by John Hattie that is taken as a vademecum, I think, by policymakers everywhere, which attempts to generalize educational results from millions of different places in millions of different contexts and to come up with some very strange conclusions, which, I think that education is very particular and context...
You just keep the microphone up.
And context dependent. But I'm wondering if your thesis is actually rather more radical than you might have let on, because if you take... I don't know how far you were agreeing with Geertz and Bourdieu. If you take what Geertz said, that context includes interpretative aspects of meaning when we're dealing with social matters, and what Bourdieu says about habitus, about internalized histories and memories, and given that we all have different interpretive aspects of meaning and internalized histories and memories, and different groups have different ones, I'm wondering whether this makes social science impossible, if social science is seen as producing universal generalizations. And of course, the tricky sort of area is where you've got, I think, which is what possibly the last speaker was pointing to, where you've got these medical things where there seem to be physical aspects, but actually treatment includes social aspects as well. So you might get some sorts of generalizations there, but I'm wondering whether you get generalizations in a more purely social aspect where there aren't physical effects as well involved. I mean, does your thesis really mean there can't be such a thing as a social science?
I don't think science, so I do have a more radical view. I don't think science has to do with establishing general truths, though some sciences manage to establish some general truths. There's a lot of scientific enterprise that provides you with information that allows the construction of new devices that allows you to piece together what's likely to happen if you try to introduce male circumcision in an area where it has traditionally been a rite of passage, that we can come to understand that situation and use rules of thumb, that we've gotten general rules of thumb, but we do have, I think that, first of all, so I don't think that the job is primarily to establish generalizations and then try and get down from the generalizations. And then, so much of social science does come to do with having understanding of how a social structure is working, and that's peculiar to the different social structures. And sometimes, even though you and I have different internalized history, there's, for the relevant feature, which is our ability to have this conversation, that's enough shared to, for the same thing to work for you as for me. But anyway, it is a more, underlying it is actually the view that a lot of science is not about establishing generalizations. It's gaining knowledge, which is sometimes very local and. But I actually think that a lot of that's what goes on in successful applications of physics.
Okay,
But you know that, yes.
Ask one, just push you a bit further.
Yes.
Yes, I agree that you and I have a shared understanding of certain things. And I've read some of your books. We are having a kind of conversation about philosophy. But how does science come into this? I mean, isn't this just normal human interaction? You
were speaking about social science. I think that some social scientists, some social scientists are very good, and some social science methods are and strategies and approaches are very good at providing us with an understanding of what's going on in a social setting, which understanding is not available otherwise if you don't do this process of looking for more general concepts, looking for new concepts, looking for prodding the process to see if something is a causal process or a mere association, looking for variation, looking for what kinds of factors afford certain social causal processes and what don't. I think that's all a job of social science, and it's often done relatively well.
We're coming towards the end of the period that's available to us for discussion, but I just wanted to give one last chance. I know there's somebody here who wants to ask a question or make an observation. Is there anybody who I missed in the previous part of this? No. Okay, so the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Nancy. That was brilliant. I really enjoyed it. I guess the question is, what advice would you give to policymakers in terms of coming up with a better way of making policy that is more sensitive to context? Because one of the things that struck me about the example of the nets is that another ways in which context matters are priorities. So obviously, if your priority is not to starve, then you don't care if they give you the nets to protect from malaria, because obviously there are different priorities. So I wonder whether...
And if your priority is you've had a really, really, really dull day, and you've got a chance to buy a licorice rather than put the pennies away for protein for the children later, that's what Duflo and Banerjee are pointing to. Yes.
That's right. Yeah, I was trying to give another twist, which wasn't kind of the weakness of the will, but more
on
the positive side. It's the priority is really not starving, and you need to secure that there is fish on the table that night. Obviously, there's another use of the net that is not using net for protecting from lice. I don't know. I don't know whether there is an easy kind of rule of thumb before taking this context sensitivity into the picture.
There is the idea that I think there's some simple advice, which is they're now rolling out, WHO and the World Bank roll out policies across all of Africa on the basis of 3 RCTs in a few different African places. And if would be okay if it were costless and we knew we had some pretty good reason to think there were no downsides, but there are. And so it just seems to me that responsibility suggests that we do more study in each place. And then I think it is a matter of weighing up our epistemic situation and the costs and benefits. And so, as I said, it might be this has worked somewhere, and it's the only thought we have, and it probably won't do anybody any harm, so let's try it here. Right? Or, well, you know, it might well have, we've got some reason to think that if you do it wrong, people are going to be hurt, then you have to, then you need more local information before you should be following up on that. So I think there's some sort of straightforward advice, which is to stop generalizing from 3 studies or do a meta-analysis on 3 studies and think, oh, we've done a meta-analysis now, you know, we really know what's going on, and think about what you're doing what's being done case by case, and then sometimes would be perfectly all right to roll a policy out across all of Africa. I mean, I'm not quite sure what policy that would be, but.
Thank you very much. I'm going to, in just a moment, call upon our General Secretary, Professor Alexander, to give a vote of thanks. Before I do, however, I just wanted to offer a short advertisement, but also a gift. This, of course, is the city of David Hume. Some of you will be aware from reviews in newspapers recently that a new intellectual biography of Hume has just been published by one of my colleagues, in fact, at St Andrews, James Harris, and is being rightly very well received. Hume's life was, of course, a very interesting one. But there's another account of Hume's life, at least one other account of Hume's life, which is the one that he himself provided. When he could see that his days were drawing to a close, he sat down and wrote something which he indeed entitled My Own Life, a short account. And the Royal Society of Edinburgh here has produced a very nice edition of this, a facsimile edition, and then the text also. And I feel that, as the one hand as chairman of the Royal Institute of Philosophy, but also as a fellow of the Society, I'm going to exercise my role as a fellow of the Society at this point, and if I may make a gift to you of this short life of David Hume, which I think you might enjoy. Hume, of course, was a skeptic of a slightly different sort with regarding matters of causality. But that would be the subject of another discussion. So thank you very much indeed.
Oh, no, good. Thank you very much. Thank you all for the helpful discussion.
I should perhaps add that for those of you who haven't given the lecture, the facsimile edition of Hume's My Own Life is available for purchase from the Royal Society of Edinburgh. I hope that Professor Cartwright will forgive me if I slip into anything that looks like an insupportable generalisation in what I'm about to say. I was reflecting on how I would test a good public academic lecture. And it seemed to me that it should be such that the intelligent layperson understood the thrust of the argument. Secondly, that the lecturer's use of evidence and sources engaged and stimulated the listener. That the listener leaves the room needing and indeed wanting to think more about the subject of the lecture. And fourthly, that there has been a willingness in the presentation to challenge accepted wisdom, even, if I dare say it, to be iconoclastic. These are 4 criteria. Tick, 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 tick. I think, for me, your lecture satisfied all of these. My own discipline was to start off life as a political scientist and then move into public sector management. And I used to say to my students and to people that I was consulting for that a general principle, and I use the term carefully and with some hesitation, was that evidence-based policy is a damn sight better than policy-based evidence. I still cleave to that view. It does fall trippingly off the tongue. There's no doubt about that. But I now have to think about what I mean by evidence, how I judge the quality of that evidence, and how convincingly different kinds of evidence suggest what the policy should be. I'm going to think about that long and hard. This evening, ladies and gentlemen, we've had a lecture that has been stimulating, erudite, critical, and thought-provoking. May I suggest to you that that's not bad value for a miserable December evening in Edinburgh. Nancy, thank you very, very much indeed for your lecture. This building is dedicated to enlightenment and useful knowledge. You satisfy these criteria too. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for coming, and safe home. Thank you.